So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be having this conference, and I'm very happy to be inviting you to our Miلی Bלום Disability Studies Conference on the topic of accessible futures, intersecting futurity and disability. Of course, you probably can imagine that we had to change the conference a bit, which was originally supposed to be face-to-face until the world shook and changed, and none of us could have controlled everything and all the changes that are happening. But I think it's very nice as the topic that we have for our 4-day conference fits in very well with the changes that have been taking place in Israel and around the world. And it's nice to see, although my screen can only show 25 people, but it's nice to see among them both faces that I'm familiar with, as well as faces from abroad. So maybe this change that brings with it the Zoom will always bring to new friendships with people that are not familiar with. So welcome to our conference. My name is Professor Shirley Werner. I'm a member of the Center for Disability Studies and a member, of course, of the School of Social Work at the Paul Burwood School of Social Work and Social Welfare. And I'm very happy to be welcoming all of you to our digitalized conference on accessible futures, intersecting futurity and disability. It's also an opportunity for me to say that the Center for Disability Studies has been up for approximately 4 years, more or less. It is a joint venture between the School of Social Work and Social Welfare at the Hebrew University and the JDC joint, and it's also an opportunity, of course, Ronnie, that I will introduce in a bit, is going to be saying some more words of thanks and welcome, and we'll be introducing all of our members, but it's also an opportunity for me to thank the very fruitful and supportful relationship that we have with Joint Israel on this conference, and in general throughout our activities. It's also an opportunity for me to welcome all of you to join our Facebook, where you will see all of the other ongoing things that we have throughout the years. If you're interested, you can also apply for a mailing list. If you just write your email in the chat boxes, we'll be able to add you to our mailing list if you're interested. I will say in parentheses that most of our activities are in Hebrew, but from time to time, we do have activities in English. It's helpful for all of us that need experience in rubbing off our English a little bit. So it's a good opportunity for us once in a while, and especially probably once a year, that we do have some activities that are taking place in English. So we welcome you to join all of this. Some of the technical things that I do want to share with you before we go on. The conference will take place for 4 days. 3 of the days starting today, about 2 hours for each of the days, where we have 1 lecture and 1 commentator, and then we do have some time for feedback and questions. All of this will be taking place in English, but if any of you are shy and you would like to ask a question in Hebrew, you can always either ask it out loud or write it in our chat box, and we'll be able to bring up questions. I can't promise that we'll be able to bring up all of the questions, but we will try to take, when we have time for questions, some of the questions that are brought up in our chat box. Beyond that, I assume all of you are already familiar with Zoom, but it's an opportunity to remind all of us to keep the mic on mute, except for the time that we have questions to be asking. The 4th day of our conference, which will be on Thursday, this will be a day that will be conducted in Hebrew, and we will have a panel in which we will talk about issues having to do, of course, with accessible futures, and a bit about how these accessible futures take place in relation to a COVID pandemic. This is an opportunity to say that we do have closed captioning, so if you need closed captioning, you just need to press on the CC button. It's also an opportunity, of course, to thank Tamar Spanier, and we will thank her again afterwards for being our live translator on this. I think I went pretty much through all the technical issues. Anything missing, Ronnie, for me?
No, everything's clear.
Okay. Wonderful. Can always raise a hand if anything is not clear, if anything is missing, just remind me. So it's a wonderful for me to a few people that I will have to thank, and Ronnie will do most of the things after in his opening statement. So I'm giving the floor to Dr. Ronnie Holler, the head of the Center for Disability Studies, a member of the Paul Bearwood School of Social Work and Social Welfare, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He will be stating his greetings and opening statements. He will probably not say the following and will probably kill me afterwards for saying this, but it's also an opportunity to congratulate him for receiving senior lecturer just 2 days ago. So this will be his title.
You're definitely right, and I'm going to kill you afterwards. Thank you. So it's my turn.
It's your turn.
So good afternoon and welcome everyone. As Shirley said, my name is Dr. Ronnie Holler. I'm a faculty at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the head of the Center for Disability Studies. It is a great honor for me to be opening this first annual Miلی Bלום Disability Studies Conference. Our goal in this conference is to promote discussion concerning the place of people with disabilities in the world in the future. We believe that the future and the use of technology could indeed lead to a greater inclusion in our society. And if I may quote Professor Katie Ellis, who will speak here today, technology can be visioned as the last best hope for accessibility. However, and this is most importantly, in order to achieve this vision, to achieve this, we need to leave aside our naive vision of the future and critically examine the complex relationship between mute everyone. Yeah, thank you. So we need to leave aside our naive vision of the future and critically examine the complex relationship between the future, disability, and accessibility. One key example of such a problematic vision of the future is what the scholar Rosemary Gellin-Thompson calls eugenic world building. This is the ideology and practice of using technology in order to control who reproduces, how they reproduce, and what they reproduce. This ideology in the form of selective reproduction, for example, genetic manipulation, or medical normalization, generates a fantasy about a better future in which disability no longer exists. Our aim, actually, in this week is to question this naive vision. Our leading question will be, how can we reimagine a future in which people with disabilities are no longer a problem that needs to be fixed, but rather a valued community and an integral part of society? In this discussion, we will attempt to reconceptualize key concepts like accessibility, technology, ableism, activism, and social policy. I'm sure it will be very interesting, including our talk today. As Shirley said, I'd like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to a few people who helped us make this event possible. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful, really wonderful partnership that we have with Joint Israel. I would especially like to thank Michal Shmuel and Efrat Stern for their belief, trust, and support. I would also like to warmly thank the Dean of our school, Professor Muna Khura Kasabri, who is here today, and our Associate Dean Ori Sagi for being supportive at all times. I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Bלום family, which is funding this conference. Thank you very much, Jim, for your generosity, kindness, and openness. Really thank you. Like many families, the Bלום family is connected personally to disability. Jim's brother had a disability, and for many years, his mom, Miלי, zichronah livracha, was the main caregiver. Leading up to the conference, we had the chat, Shirley and me, with Jim, who turned our attention to a book written in the early 50s by Dr. Levinson, one of the pioneers in the medical disability field, and also his brother's physician. Jim told us how Dr. Levinson represents the values of justice and inclusion, and I want to take this opportunity to quote from Levinson's book. The time has come that we will realize that the fact that intellectual disability is a public matter, and therefore it is the public's responsibility to deal with it. This social framework, written in a different era and discipline, was at the time of Dr. Levinson an important step and has a relevance until today. I would also like to thank Vivian Bernstein and Maggie Bolstad from the American Friends of the Hebrew University for connecting us with Jim and for their helpful advice all along the way. Much appreciation also to our brilliant speakers, including Katie, who will be here today, who have been willing to share their valuable knowledge and to take part in this important but challenging discussion. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the best team in the world, Professor Shirley Werner, we already know Nili Breuer, Ofer Konenfeld, who are the brains and heart behind this event. And if you speak of family, many thanks to the most important person in this conference, Tamar Spanier, our own translator. And of course, thank you all for joining us today and taking part in our attempt to reimagine an accessible future. I hope you also enjoy it and we will have fun. It's also fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you. Okay. The next person that I was supposed to invite now to say some words of welcome is Efrat Stern, but she was unfortunately not able to come, which is on the one hand sad for us, but then you get to hear me for another minute. So it's an opportunity to thank also Efrat. Efrat is the director of Israel Unlimited at the Joint. Israel Unlimited is a partnership between JDC Israel, the Israeli government, and Ruderman Foundation. And they've been partners with us on the Center for Disability Studies for the last 4 years, and we do hope that this partnership will continue. Efrat was not able to come and say some words of welcome, but she did wanted me to say a few words on her behalf. And especially note the fact that when we're dealing with this pandemic and this crisis that's worldwide around the world, brings with it a lot of challenges, and we will talk about many of these challenges in the next few days, but it also brings with it a lot of opportunities that we can learn from them. And thus the period of time where we're at today really fits into the conference theme of accessible futures. So these are some words from Efrat, and we will see her in the next couple of days as well. Last, but very, very importantly, a few words from Jim Bloom, an opportunity to also, of course, thank him personally for being supportive of us, not only in terms of anything that has to do with financing, but really being partner with us on the thoughts of what we can do in this conference and what we should do, and always having a pleasure to chat with Jim along the way. Jim sent us some words of welcome, which we will show now.
Does everyone see?
We can see.
Yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to the International Conference on Accessible Futures at the Hebrew University School of Social Work. On behalf of our family, the Alvin and Millie Blum family, we wish that every child, no matter what disability, can find a useful place in society. We wish you great success in your endeavors and dialogues. With best regards.
Wonderful. So this was Jim, and thank you, Jim, from our heart. So it gives me great pleasure to be introducing Professor Katie Ellis, the director of the Center for Culture and Technology at the School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry at Curtin University, Australia. Professor Ellis writes on the various intersections of technology, social media, popular culture, and disability, and has numerous publications in these fields. In 2019, she published the book Disability and Digital Television Cultures, Representations, Access, and Reception. Together with Gerlin Thompson, Kent, and Robertson, she also published an edited volume titled Interdisciplinary Approaches to Disability, Looking Towards the Future. Professor Ellis will discuss the novel role of digital technologies after the outbreak of coronavirus. The talk offers a comprehensive overview of how people with disability utilize digital formats and platforms for communications, connection, and social participation within education, entertainment, health, and the built environment. She will emphasize the importance of mainstreaming digital access in ways that benefit both people with and without disability. So I welcome Katie. I will say that after Katie, we will have Kermit Spiegelman as a commentary. So I do urge you to keep all the questions to the end after Kermit's words. And if you do have questions in the ongoing, please do write them on the chat box and we will be able to go back to them during the time of questions. So Katie, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Do I share my screen from here, Offa, or are you doing it?
Yeah, you can share it and it will, you have permission for it.
Okay. All right, apologies, it's my first Zoom presentation in a little while. So today I'm going to be so great to see so many of you showing up on Zoom as well. I'll be talking about some research that I did before coronavirus and then how some of the findings that came about through that basically changed or took on a greater importance to more and more people after, you know, we were all sent home to work from home. So my talk is remote digital access to work and life is a human right. So first of all, I'm going to touch a bit on the social and the human rights approaches to disability and then talk about the way the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability really has a digital aspect to it, and make the argument that that convention really does clearly articulate digital rights and emphasises again and again how digitisation will help achieve a lot of the human rights explained through that convention. A lot of my work recently has been drawing on the notion of inclusive design or universal design and how designing for the broadest possible user base really actually benefits everyone. And I think, Ronnie, what you were talking about earlier, how we need to start thinking about people with disabilities not being a problem to be fixed, but as a group who have something to offer, you know, innovation, insight to society. And I think we can see that through universal design. And then I'll get on to my, my captions research, which, you know, we began long before the pandemic, but then some of the results started coming in during the pandemic that made us, you know, think again about the importance of captions, particularly in education and during the pandemic as we all moved on to digital platforms. So I'm sure you're all very aware of the social model of disability, but I like to start with it anyways, just so you know exactly where I'm coming from. So in my work, I start from the position that society puts barriers on top of people who might have impairments. And so these barriers are really related to the environment, so creation of inaccessible environments. Here I've got in my little graphic, so the environment's related to buildings, but we also need to think about the digital environment and how that is created in an inaccessible way as well. I find a lot that when technology is created, it has this sort of inherent notion of who the preferred user should be, and that is not always a person with disability. Although, like I say, you know, the innovation aspect is something we really need to start thinking about more and more. Some more socially created barriers are the prejudice, you know, the attitudes, the stereotyping, discriminations that is put on top of people who have impairments. And the organisational socially created barriers really a significant issue in the context of the educational work that I'm doing here, where I look at captions. So if people who can't hear are not provided captions within the educational environment, you know, they're being disabled by the inflexible policies and procedures within education, or if it takes a long time for them to get access to that. It's another example of socially created disability. So the rights model of disability I also like, because it goes beyond the social model and gives us a bit more of a framework for how to remove these socially created barriers. And the thing I really like about the human rights model of disability is the assumption that, you know, everyone has human rights, and that should not be predicated on the absence of impairment. So it shouldn't be you all have human rights unless you have an impairment. So within this, we see that people with disabilities should have the same rights as everyone else, but it's those environmental, attitudinal, organisational barriers that are creating the obstacles to the enjoyment of those human rights. And I think approaching disability in this way really puts the onus onto society and onto governments and onto institutions like universities to take responsibility for changing the environment so that people with disabilities are able to enjoy their human rights. So to get right onto the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2006. So there are a few different points in the convention I wanted to signal out to you today, and that's the preamble, which says recognising the importance of accessibility to the physical, social, economic and cultural environment, to health and education, and to information and communication in enabling persons with disabilities able to fully enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we can see there in the preamble that they're highlighting the importance of information and communication. So this is where the digitisation starts for me in that convention. Article 9, which is accessibility, again, it relates to digital life. So to enable persons with disabilities to live independently and participate fully in all aspects of life, state parties shall take the appropriate measures to ensure to persons with disabilities access on an equal basis with others to the physical environment, to transportation, to information and communications. So again, we see information and communications is being highlighted on an equal level to the physical environment. This is just as important to people with disability as you know, a ramp in the physical environment. Article 24 is about education. So we need to ensure that persons with disabilities are able to access general tertiary education, vocational training, adult education and lifelong learning without discrimination and on an equal basis with others. So to this end, state parties shall ensure that reasonable accommodation is provided to persons with disabilities. And I think, again, we're seeing a lot in the educational sector that that access is being provided through digital avenues. And Article 30, which is about cultural life and access to cultural life. This article talks about how people with disabilities should have the right to participate on an equal basis as persons without disabilities to all aspects of cultural life. Now that includes television, art, culture, and education is also mentioned again in Article 30. So to move on to principles of universal design, the thing I really like about universal design is it talks about designing technologies, products and environments to be able to be used by the broadest amount of people as possible in the most intuitive way as possible without having to have a particular body type, without having to understand a particular language or, you know, have whatever history. So the first aspect in my picture here is of equitable use. So the design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. So in this picture, there's the picture of the self-opening doors, which, you know, is something that benefits people with disabilities and using wheelchairs. True. There's also a person pushing a shopping trolley in this picture, but I think during COVID, you know, people were not touching doors in public places either. So that was another example of how maybe something designed perhaps for a person with disabilities or people with limited mobility helped us all during COVID. The second picture is of left and right-handed scissors scissors that can be used by both left and right-handed people. So that's a flexibility in use so that anyone could pick it up and use it. Why would you limit a pair of scissors to one particular mobility there? So that's flexibility in use is the second principle of universal design. The third one is about design being simple and intuitive. So people can just understand how to use the technology without you know, having to understand the language, for example. And I think this has become more and more important to the mainstream population, particularly since Web 2.0, where, you know, people go on social media and other types of platforms like that, and they just expect to know how to be able to use it. They don't want to be taught how to use it. So that's a simple and intuitive use that, and also relates to point 4, the perceptible information. We just want to be able to pick up some technology, know how to use it, not have to be taught how to use it. Just before I came on today, I was reading some findings of a study we did into how people with vision impairments use their smartphones. And that was something that came up in that research, that people who were blind or had low vision just wanted to be able to use their phones. They didn't want, just like everyone else, you know, really is the point. They didn't want to have to be taught how to use a phone, but they would have appreciated the help if they could get it. So now point number 5 is a low tolerance for error, which again comes back for the simple, be able to use. Low physical effort is another principle of universal design, and flexibility in size and space for approach and use. So people use different technologies in different ways, and there should be enough flexibility within the technology to allow that. So we've got the example here of someone in a wheelchair going through this barrier, so they can go through in a seated position, but someone also walking can also be registered by the technology. And basically the takeaway from this is flexibility and equality in use, and the intuitive nature of it, that people can just use technology without having to be taught too much about how to use it. We already know how to do it. We're using technology, digital technology all the time in our lives. So I've got this picture here that I decided to put on because it's of someone working from home during COVID quarantine measures. And the thing I liked so much about this picture is just the setup and the way this person has changed their environment to suit them, you know. And I think we're all doing this, right? Probably not all of us had this type of setup. He's got 2 screens, a laptop, 2 keyboards, a mobile phone, different microphone arrangements and speakers, but this is how this person has liked to set up their work from home environment. And I'm sure they make use of all these technologies, and in their home office environment, they can do that. They might not be able to do that at work, but working from home, this is how they could set up their environment, and they wanted to do it that way. You know, and I think we can really draw on the experience of people with disabilities in these sorts of situations, who for a long time might have been asking to work from home because they could set up their assistive technology, which may or may not be assistive technology. It could just be technology, right? But because of the attitudinal barriers that I mentioned earlier, you know, their employers might have said, no, you can't possibly do your job from home. But now we know that people can do their jobs from home in a lot of occasions. And doing that has allowed people to set up their environment in the way that they would like to have it set up. And another thing that I have also observed during the COVID shift to digital platforms has been a lot of the discourse around it and how to do it effectively is really, it's disability communication. It's providing frameworks for supporting people with disabilities in the workplace, but now everyone is really reaching out for this and wanting this. So, you know, 6 tips for working remotely. The first one being proper technology. People with disabilities do need assistive technologies, and they've been prevented from getting access to that for a variety of reasons. Could be funding, could be, you know, availability of technology, or the technology is not developed that is considering them to be the preferred user or the ideal user that I mentioned earlier. So now everyone needs the proper technology. So that's something people with disabilities would have always benefited from. The secure connection, having a proper adequate connection is something that people with disabilities have been asking for a long time in my country, Australia. That doesn't always happen, whereas people with disabilities might, you know, not have the funds again to be able to access the internet access that they require to do their work from home, depending on where in the country they live. So clear expectations is another 6 tip for working remotely. I think this is something that, you know, people just need. They want to know what it is they need to do, how much time they have to do it. And I think what we find in a lot of workplaces is that the problem is always thought to be the person with disability or their way of doing things, rather than, you know, the communication not being clear about what it is the person can do, or the understanding that this person may be able to achieve the same goal but in a different way. You know, it's just this idea of we've always done it this way, I want you to do it that way, particularly in education, you know. So trust. We trust you to work from home. There's been a lot of mistrust of people with disabilities wanting to work from home, whether they will actually get the job done. And the platforms, the communications programs that we're using, like Zoom and Teams, now these are just so much more widely available. So I've got a picture here of, I did a search for telehealth, and this is my favourite one that come up. I think it's from Forbes. So people are now able to access health appointments remotely, whereas prior to the coronavirus, they weren't. And in Australia, where I live, where there's large remote areas where people with disabilities have to get to the main cities to go and, you know, see specialists and things like that, and that can be a big journey for these people, particularly when there's, you know, limited funding. So now these, or everyone, but particularly for these groups of people with disabilities, being able to access their specialist appointments through telehealth has been a really big shift and a really empowering shift for these groups. And I think we're seeing, again, going by that universal design framework, that this is something that a lot of groups are really benefiting from and would like to see continue after the pandemic. And again, with my my research into people with vision impairments using their phones, they were talking about how they were using their phones more during the pandemic. And one person we talked to was talking about training their guide dog. They just got a new guide dog, and so that guide dog had to be trained. And when the pandemic hit, that training, you know, possibly had to stop. But what happened was the training took place via their phone through telehealth measures, which is really cool, I think, that we have the possibility to do those things, and for the rest of the population to see also likewise the benefits in doing so. This quote is from a blog that was published in 2007, and it just talks about how technology is our last best hope for accessibility. And what the author's talking about is, you know, in the physical world, sometimes there are actual reasons why things can't be accessible. And they talk about a blind person never being able to drive a car manually, or someone in a wheelchair not being able to climb steps of an ancient stone cathedral. And they talk about how technology is not like the physical world, because it can take any shape, and technology is our slave and we can make it do what we want. With technology, there are no good reasons, only excuses. And I think we've really seen that during COVID, that a lot of the, you know, these ancient stone cathedrals, a lot of the cultural aspects of access have really opened up the world for huge numbers of people, like people with disabilities who haven't been able to go out and experience theatre, culture and things like that, because the physical environment is accessible and decisions have been made for so long to not make them accessible. Now we've been able to access museums and other sorts of cultural activities through the internet. And so that brings me to a couple of people that I've spoken to recently post-COVID in my research program here in the Centre for Culture and Technology. So the first quote was, I was asking people, you know, how's things changed for you during COVID-19. This was during the first wave here in Australia, when people were staying at home, and we were having a huge supermarket crisis here where people couldn't get into the shops, and there were long lines, and big fights over toilet paper and things like that. So one person I talked to, she said if it weren't for the anxiety, that her life would be, in practical terms, some better right now, because she was able to access the music and the art and the culture online. She was able to get deliveries to her house without having to sign for them from so many different places, but the supermarket stuff was still hard for her to get into. She was getting rebated telehealth, the whole banana, like everything was opening up for this person who is generally housebound. So yeah, she was saying when everyone had to change the world because we were all forced to, it opened up a whole part of, social participation for her that she hadn't been able to access before. And the second quote is from someone from my research into the blindness community that I've been mentioning a bit so far. And they said they don't currently use apps to help them navigate urban space, but with social distancing coming on, they're anticipating a need to use something like ARIA to help them get around. So they could have help following someone into a medical consultation, for example, instead of taking their arms and getting too close. So they were talking about using the technology to kind of distance them from having to, when we were all socially distancing, from having to touch another person, particularly a stranger. Maybe an app-based approach would be a better, safer way of doing things. But problem with ARIA for this person is that you have to subscribe to it, and that's another expense imposed on top of people with disabilities. So I think, since the beginning of the COVID crisis, we've been getting a lot of really interesting insights from this community, and a lot of the times I'm noticing that, they're drawing on their innovation that they've had to establish as a person with a disability living in an ableist world or a disabling world. So a lot of the hacks or the adaptations they've had to come up with through necessity are something that the world is now benefiting from. All right, so now I'm going to talk a bit about my captions research. So captions are an example of inclusive design, and they were designed to assist viewers who have hearing impairments. I see we've got captions available here today, which is really great, and I'm so relieved because I thought, I'll be talking about captions. So captions, the presentation of the audio component of audiovisual content as text on screen, descriptions of any type of sound that a person who can't hear would not be able to hear. And they're usually situated at the bottom of the screen to minimise the interference with the picture and time to appear alongside the appropriate speech. All right, so something I've observed in the last few years is that captions are really becoming quite a mainstream thing, and that people without any kind of hearing difficulty are using captions to access their entertainment. So they're streaming services like Netflix. I've been hearing a lot about how people are using captions to say focus on the screen, because we're all watching a lot more television now because we can stream whatever we want. We can binge on everything. So captions are one tool people are using to try to stay focused on all the TV and streaming that they're binging on. So the more TV you watch, the more TV you miss out on, is what I like to say. So here are a couple of articles about how captions are being mainstreamed. We've got the real reason you use closed captions for everything. It is that this article is all about how captions help anchor you into the program, so you pick up on those cues that you might be missing if you're watching a lot of television. And same with the second article, which is a blog post, Get Over Your Fear of Subtitles. And the person who wrote this blog is talking about how she's used subtitles, captions for a very long time, and she introduces it to these other people in her life. And we saw this also earlier in the year when last year actually, when Queer Eye for the Straight Guy on Netflix was criticised for having inaccurate captions or for not accurately captioning what was happening on screen. And as a result of that, a lot of people spoke about how they needed captions, and people with disabilities were talking about how they needed captions, and they were bringing it up to Netflix again and again. Someone even made an Excel spreadsheet documenting all the inaccessible captions but got no response from Netflix. But it wasn't until, you know, the Queer Eye for the Straight Guy example, where one of the people in the shows talked about how important captions were to everyone, and then Netflix, that elicited a response from Netflix that it actually got some attention, and, you know, people started talking about how they were using captions. A lot of the audience actually did use captions. So this got us thinking here at Curtin, what about our students? You know, do our students also expect captions in their education? So if our students are immersed in this world where people are streaming videos and they're expecting and using captions in these online videos, do they expect us to provide them in our lectures as well? So we've been working on this for a few years. We started back in 2016 and offered captions to about six units just in my department, where we just made captions available on the screen. We didn't promote them too heavily. We just said, look, here's captions, use them if you want to, and tell us what you do with them, to all the students. And so what we found then was that students were actually using the captions, and then after they left our units, went on to our colleagues' units. They then started asking them for the captions, you know, where are the captions? So 2 years later, we heard about this technology by Echo 360, where they automatically generate transcripts and captions. And so we trialed this technology to see if it was any good. In 11 units in 2018 across my whole school, not just my department. So it's 11 units twice. So in effect, it's 22 units that we offered these captions on. We made them available to all students. And then afterwards, we interviewed 53 students about their experiences of using the captions. You know, how did they find these captions? Were they useful or not? Did they expect them to be there? How accurate did they think they needed to be? So the students that we interviewed, some of them identified as having a hearing impairment and some had sensory processing difficulties, but the majority of them were just mainstream students trying to study with distractions competing for their time. So I should have mentioned, of the 53 students, these were all external students. So the majority were, you know, they were studying from home, trying to make sure they could concentrate, get work done while their whole family was around. So what we found in these 53 interviews were quite a few interesting things. So the first one was that the students all talked a lot about how they had diverse learning styles, and that captions can be used alongside of a variety of other tools they use in education. And what we found was these students were actively picking and choosing what tools they'd use in education based on how they best learnt. So if they identified as visual learners, for example, and things like that. So they expected the captions to be accurate. They thought, yeah, inaccurate captions were just not good enough. They did expect the captions to be available for them to use. And that was based on the fact that they are widely available in other media. They can access captions in any other media they want to, and online lectures are just another example of an online media for this group. So they expected the captions to be available for them there. Something we found was that students talked about multitasking while watching lectures. And so a number of the students talked about watching lectures a few different times, watching lectures, you know, in a faster speed. And they were using these captions as a way to retain their focus on the lecture, maybe while they were doing other things, maybe they were at work, maybe they were at home with their kids, and that the captions really helped improve the clarity of the lecture. And so something on a practical level, they thought captions could provide them the correct spelling of, you know, technical terms that might have come up in the lecture. And this was really important for this group, who were external students, and they felt like they didn't get the opportunity to ask in class, what is the correct technical spelling of this word? And they did also talk a lot about how it's difficult as an external student accessing an online lecture, that the lecturer doesn't really tailor the lecture for them at home. They concentrate more on the people in the lecture theatre. So they thought that provision of captions could assist with improving the quality of teaching in an online environment, was where maybe the lecturer would fall down by walking around the room. The transcript and the caption track could pick that up and fill in the blanks for them. In a way, so like I said, they saw captions as a tool. They saw captions as a tool that's available widely in other media. It's a tool that could assist their learning. So because of both of those things, they just had an expectation, that the university should actually make captions available. Like, there was no excuse. If this tool's available, the university should provide it to the students, was their strong feeling. They hoped that accurate captions would become more and more available as technology improved. So they saw the captions as something that could improve comprehension, and therefore maybe they might get higher grades in their classes, and they could perhaps better manage access to educational materials. And they're aware that they were dealing with complex visual and audio material in these lectures. But something else that I noticed that came up in this study was that every student that we talked to was aware that they were learning with students with disabilities, and they understood that captions were an accessibility feature to make education more accessible to students with disabilities. And all of them, without question, said that yes, it should be made available for the students with disabilities. There's really no excuse for that, but that it is also something that they could benefit from as a learning tool. So number one for them was probably that the accessibility measure, that the environment should be changed to include people with disabilities in their classes as well. Okay, so I've got a couple of quotes from some of the interviews we did. So we've got an online student who accesses all of their lectures online, and she was viewing them multiple times, and sometimes she'd stop the lectures while she was taking notes and replay sections where she'd lost focus. This was her approach to accessing lectures throughout her degree. And so if she misses the main points or has difficulty understanding what the lecturer is saying, she would replay the lectures. But that she usually does this at home in an office, which is separated from the rest of her family. But, you know, maybe her family doesn't always respect that separation, and she gets interrupted all the time by teenagers who might want attention in her house. You know, reading the transcript from this interview was probably the one where I went, hang on, this is really, you know, so important now that everyone's working at home talking about their kids interrupting them and still having that expectation of having to get things done. So, you know, for this student, having the captions available helped for her to retain focus, especially when she had so many other competing demands at home. And then I've got a second quote from a student who, this is more about their learning style and the impact of the lecturer being, you know, uninspiring. So this person said they prefer captions over the sound because sometimes people's accents are hard to distinguish, and lecturers have monotone voices, and that can be uninspiring. And also this participant talked about needing to needing to study while her husband was sleeping. So again, having the captions as opposed to the audio option was really a vital tool for her, for the way that her environment was set up, whereby her husband couldn't be interrupted because of shift work and things like that. So I think a lot of the insights we got really did take on a different resonance when everyone was working at home and having those competing priorities and having their partners and their children also trying to work from home. So on the one hand, we did have more control over our environment by being able to set up that technology. But on the other, there was sort of less control because we were doing it, competing with the domestic realm as well. And maybe captions could help with that. So these projects that I've been talking about today, the Mainstreaming Captions project and the Vision Australia project, looking at how people using their smartphone, they took on, started pre-COVID, you know, and then post-COVID had a different insight really when we were all sent home. So the trying to retain our focus while being distracted from domestic responsibilities features heavily, and we're all to varying degrees home with our kids and other distractions now. So there's, I've been following someone called Marketing with Eva on Facebook who talks a lot about the importance of captioning online videos, so via Zoom and via Skype, Google Hangout, Teams, PowerPoint, and she's got some information available, and there are different organisations around who can provide the service. And then there's also the inbuilt live captioning, which, you know, again has varying degrees of accuracy. So, and hopefully with technology improving, that the accuracy of some of the more inaccurate captioning that's available will improve. I've had some interesting captions on some of my meetings in these platforms. So just to go back to my participant who I cited earlier in the talk, when she was talking about how her life was, you know, in practical terms, in some ways better when everything opened up digitally, the music, art and culture, and then being able to have things delivered to her house, be able to go to the doctor, rebated by telehealth, with somebody without a disability who I was speaking to at the same time, who was also talking about her experience of COVID-19 lockdowns from a digital point of view. She was saying she liked having everything come to her. On Easter, she was able to do a yoga class in Baltimore. She went to church in Texas and then watered her garden in Townsend, and she didn't even leave her property, and she was able to video chat with close friends on Saturday. And the thing that I like about these two different quotes and putting them together like this is we can see both people with disabilities and people without disabilities during COVID-19. There was real benefits in being able to have the world open to us through the internet and being able to access these different activities from our homes. So just to wrap up the talk really, so I think the outcome from this research is that digital flexible environments benefit everyone. And so we should strive to create digital flexible environments for everyone. So for example, with the captions research, that is an accessibility tool for people that do have disabilities, but when offered to the broader student population, they see benefits to it as well. And then so perhaps if, you know, we think about captions as a learning tool, this is something that could become more available to people with disabilities, and the amount of stigma applied to people requesting these features will disappear completely, because this is something that can just be made available to everyone and is not just a disability specific thing. And that's something we've all experienced during COVID. And that's it for me. I think I've gone a bit early.
Hey, Katie. I think it's fine that it's a bit early because we can use these 20 minutes that you left us to start thinking about our classes in the upcoming semester. So on the one hand, I would really like to thank you for this wonderful talk. On the other hand, Ronnie will be sad to stay these 3 next days of the conference by himself here because it seems that I have to go and start working on my lectures for next semester. So I appreciate it. I think that many of the things that you talked about highly important in terms of the challenges that we have facing us. And I think bringing together students with and students without disabilities, because now we're sort of equal in terms of having the various challenges as well as the various opportunities that are open for this. So thank you, Katie. Of course, you're staying with us because I already see that there are many questions on the chat, and I remind everyone that we will get back to these questions, and if you have other questions, please do write them and we will have time to go into all of these questions. And also remind again that if someone wants to write a question in Hebrew, that's also fine and we'll translate these questions. So it's a pleasure for me to be introducing Dr. Kermit Spiegelman from the Department of Community Mental Health at the University of Haifa. She is a great colleague of us at the center, and we've also had our own joint research on COVID. And so Dr. Spiegelman research links between disability studies, mental health rehabilitation, and technologies. She applies both quantitative and qualitative research methods to explore community participation and its implications on the well-being of people with disabilities in various life domains, such as employment, education, social and romantic relationships from the individual and family perspectives. So I lost you on my screen. Oh, I see you, Kermit. Yeah. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm going to share my presentation in a minute. Can you see? Yeah, okay, great. So hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much to Katie for the interesting presentation. My name is Dr. Kermit Spiegelman, as Shirley said. I focus on disability studies and technology. And I would like to comment or further discuss the issues that Katie raised in her talk. So Katie discussed the intersection between digital access and social inclusion, and she focused in her study within the context of education. I would like to take it further to the domains of communication and social relations. But first, I would like to go back to the term digital access and present 2 dimensions. The first one, when we talk about digital access or digital divide, we have to refer to the infrastructure. If, for example, if I have a computer, a laptop, a smartphone, if I am connected to the internet. The second side of the coin refers to the internet usage patterns. How do I use the internet and the application? So when we look at the digital divide from the infrastructure perspective, a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Center showed that disabled Americans are less likely to have home broadband tech devices. They are also 3 times as likely as those without a disability to say they never go online. 23% compared to 8%. when we talk about the digital divide from the internet use perspective, a recent study conducted by two Israeli researchers examined the internet adoption and internet use among people with disabilities and people without disabilities. As you can see in the graph, if we look at the half full glass, over time, internet use and access by persons with disabilities continue to increase. However, we can see that the gap between users with disabilities and without disabilities persists. So we have to take into consideration not only the infrastructure divide, but as well as internet usage divide. More data from Israel analyzed by the Commission for Equal Rights of Persons with Disabilities indicated that 90% of people without disability, the blue in the graph, used the internet in the last 3 months, compared to the green one, 81% among people with disabilities use the internet in the last 3 months. This data also indicated that as people age, they're less likely to use the internet, especially we see a decrease in internet use among two age groups, 35 to 64, and adults over the age of 65. And one explanation for this finding is the inaccessibility of the online platforms that might be challenged for this population. Within the context of COVID-19, we have to ask ourselves, what are the impacts of the pandemic we all experience on people with disabilities in terms of digital access? As Katie talked, we experience, as well as people with disabilities, changes in routine, changes in delivery of daily services, work, education, healthcare, entertainment. But so far, many studies and scholars that focused on accommodation referred mainly to accommodation for people with physical disabilities, learning disabilities, ADHD, ADD, or sensory disabilities, vision and hearing impairments, but less referred to people with cognitive impairments, like intellectual disabilities, people with communication disabilities, like people with autism, and others that experience psychiatric disabilities. Specifically for people with intellectual disabilities, we have to take into consideration the accommodation they need in terms of using plain language or picture communication symbols. At the bottom of the slide, I included a link to the last Eurovision song contest conducted in Israel in 2019 that was awarded due to the accessible services they provided to people with different types of disabilities. They provided sign language, they provided people that explain what was happening in the contest for people with intellectual disabilities, as well as other disabilities. So there are some examples that it can be done. Another point that I would like to raise is the issue of eye contact. On one end, it might be comfortable for some people with communication or psychiatric disabilities to use the online platforms these days, like we use right now. But at the same time, we have to take into consideration the question of presence. Many lecturer and teacher require from students to open the webcam to get sense of the presence of the participants. But we have to to ask ourselves, is there an option of online participation without sharing one's video in Zoom class, on Zoom meeting, or other online platform? Because it might be challenging for people with communication or social anxiety to turn on their webcam. And we have, in these days, I believe that we have to find creative ways to increase the participant sense of presence, like we do actually now, for example, by using the chat, pooling, breakout rooms, asynchronous video, like a student can record in advance their presentation or feedback, so they will feel comfortable participating in this online meeting or classes. Another issue that I would like to focus is how to use the digital technologies for communication and social relation. There are 5 main ways to well-being: connect to others, keep learning, take note, give to others, and be active. And a recent study that I conducted with Dr. Tyler Bergman from Australia as well, we focused on using digital technology for communication and informal support. In terms of these ways to well-being, we focus on connect, give to others, and being active. We actually conducted an online survey to explore how family caregivers have interacted with and supported the relative adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities residing in supported accommodation during the first wave of COVID-19, March and April 2020. As I said, we conducted a cross-sectional online survey completed by 108 family caregivers. We asked them about socio-demographic and health characteristics. We asked them about communication mode with the residents, the relatives, the satisfaction with communication, and informal support they were able to provide or not during the pandemic. So we compared the communication mode frequency before and during the pandemic. As you can imagine, due to the policy of social distancing and restriction, it's not surprising that family caregivers reported that they will not be able to meet the relative. So we found a significant decrease in face-to-face visit of family caregivers and the relatives, while there were no significant changes in text and voice messages and phone call. We observed that many of the family caregivers did look and adopted for new communication mode, and they adopted mainly the video calls to communicate, to stay in touch with the residents, the relatives. They used mainly the WhatsApp video call, Zoom, or Skype. At the same time, they expressed dissatisfaction from this communication. They reported that the remote communication did enable them to maintain or increase the level of emotional support, but they were they reported reducing their capacity to provide social support, relying on remote communication. So to conclude, I call it the AAA, awareness, access, and accommodation. First, the staff members, as well as family members in the residential setting should be aware of the potential of using the ICT to maintain frequent communication and support between the residents and their families. But they have also to provide access to the equipment, to initiate, to facilitate, to support regular contact between family and residents, especially in terms of the lockdown policy and social distancing. The staff members have to accommodate the activities they deliver from distance. And for example, they can develop social activities to engage the residents with other outside of the residential settings. Above all this, we have to remember that technological infrastructure and literacy skills are required, and not only from the residents, the people with the IDD, but also from the staff members in the residential settings. So the last slide, I present a cartoon from the Krippen website. On the floor, there are two black arrows and a sign on the wall. Please follow the arrows and keep 2 meters apart. And one person saying to a blind man, just follow the instruction, dear. And as you can see, the instructions are inaccessible. So to wrap up my presentation is that digital technologies should be integrated not only in crisis, in the current pandemic, but also in the routine, especially for basic needs of communication and social relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kermit. Very, very interesting and important talk. Before I forget, please send me that picture at the very last slide, will be very useful. So thank you. I'm opening the floor for questions. I do have already questions that have been raised in the chat, and I will be able to read out these questions. But of course, everyone is welcome to raise your hand and ask questions also here so that we can ask them. Okay. This is like a random order of questions that I'm asking. So if anyone has a more urgent question, you can bring it up. One question that was raised, how exactly can we guarantee that state institutes of different countries will apply in practice a policy of creation of full accessibility to modern technologies for disability groups of populations? It's open for the both of you, Katie and Kermit, so we can just...
Okay, I saw that question in the chat too, and I think we need to think of it from 2 different points of view. We need to look at the human rights aspect, and a lot of countries have signed on to the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So by doing that, they have agreed that they need to make things accessible. So there needs to be a way of reminding governments about that. So I think, you know, that's one side of the equation, is recognizing the human rights aspect of this, that, you know, rights don't depend on the absence of impairment. So that's one thing. And I think the universal design approach is really, really important in this argument, because, you know, if we think about technology design, and by designing for the non-preferred users, so the people on the edges, the people who might have really specific and unique needs by designing for those people. That is where technology innovation comes from. And research done here in Australia by the Centre for Inclusive Design has found that by designing for those people on the margins, you actually increase your potential user base by about 4%, and by 4, not 4%. So you quadruple your user base, and this is an issue that's coming more and more important with the ageing society. So in addition to recognising, that we should do this because it's the right thing to do, the other aspect is we should do this because it will increase your audience, your user base, and make technology more usable and accessible for probably everyone attempting to use it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Katie.
If I may say, I believe that the current pandemic raises a challenge for example, for the universities. If we deliver courses online, captioning should be part of it. So we have to find a way to enforce the regulation, especially those days.
Right. The one thing I've noted in the myself and Ronnie and Kermit, who is here along with the fourth colleague who is not here, took the opportunity of the first wave of the pandemic to examine what's happening in families of children with disabilities. And of course, all schools shut down and everything that had to do with teaching went into digitalized. And most of the families really felt that they're at a loss, that they have to be teaching their kids with disabilities, they have to be their physiotherapists, they have to be their occupational therapist. And schools had no idea. I'm saying had sort of in past tense, but actually I don't think it's too much better now. Really had no idea how to get the technology in a way that would fit the kids with disabilities. The funniest thing I heard was the school that offered a blind kid Braille lessons over Zoom. So I think really we have a lot more to still, or the schools would have a lot more. And I don't know if I'm stating my opinion or also asking a question through this, that I think that it's very important, of course, to be saying this is a human rights issue, but how do we make it really happen in practice when we don't have the time now to be changing attitudes, but we need tomorrow for the technologies to be working?
Mm. We experience similar things here in Australia, and I recently just wrote a book chapter with one of my PhD students on this very topic, about how students with disabilities really were disadvantaged during the pandemic, sudden shift to digital education. And the reason was because of, attitude change hadn't taken place prior to the pandemic. So, there was a situation where the inequalities were exacerbated because of the pandemic. Because what we found here in Australia is that a lot of the teachers were going back to kind of older styles of teaching students with disabilities. So instead of offering them alternative lessons, they just came up with different things for them to do. So for example, we talked to a mother whose child was given the job of, getting things from around the garden, and reading a much younger years storybook instead of, finding appropriate ways to learn what the rest of his class was learning, just because it was too difficult for them at the pandemic. And I think the issue is attitudes that haven't changed before, and they should have changed before. And we're seeing greater opportunities now, but we're also seeing, real disadvantage for people just trying to, live, work and go to school in this really strange time.
Thank you, Katie. There was a question brought up by Slava. Slava, do you want to ask it?
I sort of received some answers already from others, but what was behind the question is just thinking of how to push for institutions to take that upon themselves of enforcing captions into Zoom, and thinking of the ways that I was thinking about the free apps, because I was thinking of a practical way of enforcing that. If you tell them that it's free, then there's a chance that it'll work, although I'm not sure that I think the aspect of the free version and it's being inaccurate could be also the reason why they might not want to use that. So I don't know what would be the best way to enforce that.
Was your question around accuracy and whether the students thought the inaccurate ones were okay? I think, well, in my project, we mainly spoke to students without disabilities. So for them, you know, inaccurate captions were kind of okay, and they predicted that they'd just get more accurate as technology improves, and which is potentially the case. And my answer to this is we need to do some research with people with disabilities who use these features for accessibility, because I think for those groups, having inaccurate captions or 80% accurate captions is just not good enough. That's not good enough. We should be doing better than that. This is, you know, an accessibility feature for this group. And that just wouldn't cut it in terms of legislative requirements on the university to provide the features. So it would have to, if we use the automatic ones that I've been looking into, I think now, still today, they would need to be corrected in order to be accurate enough to pass as a passable accessibility feature for the people who require them. But my argument is, if we socialise this accessibility feature amongst the entire student population, then maybe it'll become more available because people were using it as learning tools. You know, they were seeing it and saying, look, University Curtin, this is a tool that's around, you should make it available to us and make it accessible and accurate.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you. Kermit, also, of course, feel free to answer anything that comes up. Any questions for both of you? I know that Miלי had a question. Hey, Miלי.
Hi, yes. First of all, I want to thank you both, Katie and Kermit, for the 2 lectures. I think it was good to have the both perspective of also emphasizing how important it is to make the digital world more accessible, but also finding the problems that of course exist, mainly more when we talk about cognitive disability than the physical or sensory ones. So I want to connect back to the image that Katie, you show us of the individual that sit in a room filled with technology and screens and the smartphone and everything. And I thought it's an interesting frame to think about the ideology that is behind our conversation now. It seems that we think about individuals as a separate atoms that can be in a separate space without anyone around them, a quiet space, that the only thing that fill the room except of this one body is technology. And this imagination of having an independent person that is only relying on technology without having any other person in the room to disturb or maybe to help, I think it's something that's sometimes conflicting the experience of disabled people that are dependent on other people, and remind us all that we need connection with people and not only with technology or through technology. And I wanted to ask, what is the role of dependency in both of your visions, or the thing that you think right discourse need to promote? can we have a promotion of digital, more accessible space that acknowledge dependency and connection with other people? Or it has to be a more ableist, independent perspective that think of us as an individual that can operate technology and nothing else?
If I could answer this first, I'll respond first. I always like to think about this from the perspective of interdependency rather than dependency, because I think everyone is dependent on other people. This is not a disability specific issue. We are as a human race, we're dependent on other people. But when it comes to disability, again, going back to that creation of attitude, when people with disabilities depend on somebody else for support or to help them to do something, it takes on a greater meaning than a person without a disability. So I remember reading a blog a while ago where someone with a disability talked about how they were really good with IT, and all her friends who weren't so good in IT would ask her for help to fix their computer problems. And whenever she offered an able-bodied person help, it was just considered normal. There was no problem with that. But if she then asked an able-bodied person for help doing something that she couldn't do, physical limitations, for example, it was like she was asking them to carry her up a mountain on their back or something. So it's that stigma, I think, that surrounds the notion of dependency and interdependency. And if we could, start to look at us all as independent creatures, none of us are individuals just operating alone, doing things. We all need to work together. And I think that's the really important vision for disability rights to go forward, is to recognise interdependency amongst people with disabilities, to people with disabilities, with supporters and carers, people with disabilities, with able-bodied people. So I like to think about interdependence.
I agree with Katie's perspective on interdependence, especially in the context of technology. But I would like to add that above all this discourse, it's the person's choice, whether we want someone that help him to operate the technology or not. If, for example, I prefer to use it by myself to share my personal thoughts, so I believe that technological development today enable me to use the technology in a different way, and it's possible to develop or to find ways to make it accessible. Again, if the person wants to do it by himself. So I believe that there are much more opportunities to use it independently or interdependently. Shirley, you are on mute.
Sorry, I said thank you. This is my technology part. Ronnie also had a question for us, right?
First of all, thank you, Kermit and Katie, for really wonderful, interesting talk. And as Miלי said, the connection between the talks and even the comparison between Israel and Australia is really, really interesting to note. And this is also my question. Do you have any data on comparative? Do you have any comparative data on disability, on digital rights? So do we know how countries differ in terms of providing digital rights to people or people with disabilities? And another question, is there any correlation or relationship between how countries developed technological wise, like Israel, we are the startup nation, so-called, and the correlation between this and how these countries provide digital rights to its citizens, and vice versa? Is there a correlation maybe between countries that are very accessible to people with disabilities, and therefore they're also accessible in terms of providing digital in providing technology and digital rights. And it's also related to another question, maybe more general question. Do digital rights behave differently than other disability rights in terms of, take up of these rights, their scope, and so on?
I believe that the digital access or accessibility is lag behind the, for example, physical accessibility. We still have much more to do in terms of awareness and enforcing the regulation to make the website, to online platforms accessible. And I believe that Ilana Benish, I'm not sure if she is here, will have more information about it.
Thank you, Kermit. Katie, maybe you have...
Yeah, I think we're going to see differences in approach from countries all over the world. But I wanted to pick up on something that Kermit said in her presentation, and that was, separating out the notion of access into both infrastructure and use. And I think this is a big issue all over the world. Accessibility is not just about making technology accessible to people with disabilities. It's about ensuring that technology is usable to these groups as well. One of our research projects, we wanted to use a particular survey platform. I won't say which one, because I don't think it's fair. And they tried so much to make the platform accessible to people who couldn't see, that they read out every single label so many times that it conflicted with different screen readers, that would read out the survey question, to the extent that organisation was, testing this in the US or UK, and they were using the most popular screen reading technologies there that nobody in Australia uses. So, my people with vision impairment in Australia couldn't use this survey platform because the creators tried to make it so accessible, but in doing so, they didn't think about the usability aspect of it. If they were reading aloud all the labels, what were the screen readers then doing? And we were in a situation where questions were being read aloud 5 times, and that was accessible, but it was not usable. And there was a clash, amongst countries in that one.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Any additional questions? I did see a couple more, but maybe folks that are actually here and we can hear you out loud, and we'll be happy to get your questions. Amit. Hi, Amit.
That's me. So I have several questions and a couple of thoughts. First of all, I think that what do you think about the hardness in different kind of accessibilities, whether it's to different people or to the same person? For example, I can say I I'm autistic, and I used to use FM device, which the microphone, which the teacher had the microphone, and I wear earrings, and so I can hear him better. But also I sometimes find it hard to read, so I use automatic reader, and sometimes it comes together and sometimes it's not. And then someone might tell me, well, but you need this hearing device. Why do you also need to why do you need something to make more? I don't explain it. I don't explain it very well. People that need different kinds of accessibility. I can say that in autistic cons, we have people that need to be very loud and people that needs to be very quiet, or people that need a lot of that in order to hear you, they need you to speak very loud, and other people that if you talk very loud, they will run away. Like, what's great about technology is I can see this talk and I can have subtitles, and other person can have the volume very high and other person can have the volume very low. But
Amit, if I understand your comment or in question, is the fact that people with various disabilities and also people without disabilities that have their individual preferences of learning and ways of learning, on the one hand, it is a challenge for technology on how to fit the different needs within one talk, let's say, and on the other hand, it might be an opportunity to fit with the various needs.
Sort of. And also, what do you think about, I mean, so most of things for accessibility is they use to bring people with disabilities to the, let's say, to the level of people without disabilities, like hearing aids, they bring you to the level of people that can hear without hearing aids. Text readers can bring someone that find it hard to read text to the level of people that can read text.
Okay, I understand what you're saying. I will let Katie and Kermit to respond to this. I will say that I'm also cautious of the time and the time that we instructed, so this will probably be our last question. So for Katie and Kermit.
May I?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Amit. You're raising a very important topic, especially if we take into consideration the percentage that about 48% of people with disabilities in Israel cope with multiple disabilities. So I'm not talking about a different person with different type of disabilities, but same person with different types of disabilities. And I believe that the current period of the pandemic present an opportunity to find creative ways how to accommodate, for example, the learning, learning in higher education, for example, from my own experience. So we will have to be creative in terms of how to divide or develop activities in chat rooms, in breakout rooms, for example, in Zoom. As I said earlier in my presentation, I believe it actually promote the opportunity to other ways of teaching and learning, but it raises the opportunities, the advantages. We can use the advantages of the technology. And as for your second comment, I believe, I think that what Katie said about the universal design can promote the participation of all people, of individual, whether they have or they don't have a disability. So we have to think and promote the perspective on universal design. And of course, it also depends on budget issue, but in general, I see the technology as an opportunity, but we have to develop and to think how to integrate technology in a smart way.
Thank you, Kermit.
Can I respond to that too?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think you exactly. Technology, digital technology should be flexible. We should be able to access a piece of information in whatever mode we want to as individuals. And about 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Disability and New Media with my colleague Mike Kent, and that was core to our argument that once you make something digital, it becomes flexible. You should be able to access it using whatever technology, whatever setup you'd like to do it. So I think, again, it comes back to the flexibility of digitization, and also the universal design aspect of technology design in terms of designing for the broadest possible user and leaving it up to them to decide how they want to access the information that's put available. And so again, coming back to this idea that there's no one preferred user that digital technology caters for, and that as users we are and should be able to access technology in whatever way we want to on whatever day. If you are accessing information by audio on one day, but you can't do it on another day for any particular reason, then you shouldn't have to. That the information should be flexible enough to be able to be read by any number of different outputs and modes.
Thank you, Katie. So thank you very much, Katie, for your talk. And thank you very much, Kermit, for the wonderful feedback to this. An opportunity to thank each and every one of you that joined us today, and to remind us that we have 3 additional days like this. Tomorrow, Dr. Gregor Walbring will be with us talking about ability expectation and ableism governance, a prerequisite of an accessible future. Just to note that the time tomorrow is a different time. It will be 5 p.m. Israel time. You can feel free, all of you have the program, to transfer it on to your colleagues, and also abroad. We do try to do our best with English, so feel free to invite any colleagues that you have who might want to join these talks. And thank you everyone for joining us here.